Hello, good evening. Welcome to Full Stack Online. My name is Jeffrey Lessel, and coming to you from the recording studios of Planning Center in beautiful Carlsbad, California, where we are not under a heavy blanket of snow. Still sunny, pretty warm today, although I am a little chilly, so I've got my heavy coat on. This is a heavy coat for California. Most of you are in California, so welcome. You know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, glad you're here. Glad you're joining us. We've got some interesting topics to discuss tonight about open source and licensing. And some of you are kind of rolling your eyes like, oh my gosh, what does that mean? You know, I'm going to check it out a different stream. But let me tell you, like, if you've watched this in the past, a couple months ago, we had a panel of other developers on, and we were talking about ways to get started and you know, put your mark in the world before you get hired, or how to get noticed for hiring purposes. And one of the things we talked about was contributing to open source. And along those lines, if the best way to contribute to open source is to open source your own stuff. And I've actually got something that I'd like to open source. And so this topic is timely. We're going to be talking about open source licensing because I'm not sure which license to put myself under. I know in the past, some of my other things I've put on GitHub, I've just kind of opened it up and put an MIT license on it. But honestly, I have no idea what that means. So that might be a bad thing. I don't know. So I'm anxious to see what we've got going on. So tonight, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Ido Tuchman. And he is an attorney here in Carlsbad. Let me bring him on the stream here. Here you go. Hey, Ido.
Hey, welcome. Gio. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So you are based here in Southern California, right? Carlsbad area?
Yeah, Encinitas. Yeah, very close.
Okay, cool. And you are a practicing attorney, correct?
That's correct. I am licensed in California, New York, Colorado, and also the United States Patent and Trademark Office.
Nice. So a lot of times you might hear us say, you know, this is not legal advice. Well, in this case, you know, it's an attorney. So maybe can you not legal advice?
Not legal advice.
No. Still not legal advice.
I am not your attorney.
Okay. Well, hopefully don't take this legal advice, but this is some good information, I'm sure. So Ido, tell me a little bit about your background. How'd you get into the tech and law world? How did those two marry for you?
Well, I'm a huge nerd. I went to undergrad as an electrical engineering major and actually graduated as an electrical engineer. Went to work for a big tech company and discovered this whole IP group in my company. And I was really fascinated by it. It was a really interesting topic. It was very important to the company. And you know, when it came time for me to decide whether I want to go to grad school, I kind of gravitated towards law school and couldn't shake it. So ended up going to law school. I didn't think like I would do anything with my law degree. I thought I'd just go back to being an engineer. But yeah, you know, $80,000 worth of debt later, you decide to go into law.
Yeah, makes you question some things.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I'm actually going to hand it over to you. For those of you watching, we are monitoring, or I'm monitoring the chat on YouTube. So if you have any questions for Ido, put them in there. I'll take note of them. And we will have a little bit of a Q&A session afterwards. Ido said he'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Not legal advice. He's not your lawyer, but he'd be happy to answer any questions you have. So put it in there. I'll see him. And other than that, I'm going to just give it away to Ido. Take it away, man.
All right. Yeah, we got the presentation. What's up, Bex? Sorry, my daughter just walked in the room.
No problem. No problem.
All right. So anyway, my talk is about open source licenses. And like Gio said, I am an attorney here in California. I have my own practice. I'm from the law office of Ido Tuchman. And I've been doing this for over 20 years. And I really enjoy it. It's actually a good mix of both technical side and the legal side. So I'm really excited to talk to you about open source licenses. But before we give the talk, I'm obligated to give the California Bar Association's standard legal disclaimer. So this presentation discusses the law and may cause drowsiness. Don't operate a motor vehicle or other heavy equipment at any time during this presentation. And like Gio said, this presentation offers legal information, not legal advice. and you should consult a legal professional about your particular situation. So now we got that out of the way. I want to talk to you guys about a case I handled a couple of years ago. A client came into my office wanting me to respond to a cease and desist letter. Now, if you've never heard of a cease and desist letter, it's basically a lawyer's way of saying, knock it off or I'm going to sue you. So if you ever get a cease and desist letter from a lawyer, don't ignore it. Now, this cease and desist letter was unusual in a couple of ways. First, the letter wasn't addressed to my client. It was addressed to an open source project. And second, the letter was written on behalf of another open source project. So another open source project hired a law firm to send a cease and desist letter to a open source project. So let me set the scene here. Project Left was an open source project, and they hired a law firm to send a cease and desist letter to Project Right, which was an open source project. And my client, who was not named in the letter, was giving me a bag of money to respond to the cease and desist letter. So you might be wondering, why would someone hire a lawyer to respond to a letter that they're not named in the letter? Well, this client was a sponsor of Project Right and had and was using Project Right's code in their proprietary software product. So they had a financial interest in making sure that Project Right was able to, carefully understand this cease and desist letter and respond to it thoughtfully. And you might also be wondering why one open source project would send a cease and desist letter to another open source project. I mean, they're both open source projects, so what's the beef here? Well, you have to understand, for this conflict, Project Left was licensing their software under the GNU General Public License, the GPL. And Project Right was licensing their software under the MIT license. And to understand why this mattered, we have to come on a copyright journey. And let me take you through some of the copyright basics to kind of understand what's going on in this conflict. So we'll start with the United States Constitution. Always a good place to start. So U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 says, Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. And this sort of sets the groundwork for Congress to pass the copyright laws in the United States. And if we look at this language here in the Constitution, basically, what we're doing is we're setting up a bargain between authors of creative works and society. We're saying, if you disclose to us your creative writings, your creative works, we will give you an exclusive right to your work for a limited time so that you can exploit your work. And by doing so, you're adding to the body of knowledge of our society. So there's a quid pro quo. If your work is very important to the public, you have this exclusivity to the work and you can monetize it and enjoy the fruits of your labor. If your work is not very important, then you probably won't get a lot of money, but you still have this copyright. So Congress did in fact pass the copyright law in the United States. There's several versions of it as time progressed, but basically a copyright is a bundle of exclusive rights. When you have a copyright on your work, be it like a painting or a manuscript or whatever, you have the exclusive right to reproduce your work, to modify your work, to distribute copies of your work, and to display your work publicly. And one thing you should know is a copyright comes about automatically. So you don't have to file any kind of special forms or pay any money to get a copyright to your work. It just automatically ripens as soon as you fix your your work, your original work, on a tangible medium. So if you write down something on paper, if you record something on film, or even if you record something on a computer memory, that's considered a tangible medium, and you automatically get a right to a copyright. And believe it or not, computer code is considered creative work, even back-end code. That's a little dig for back-end developers. So when you create computer code, you get a copyright to that code. You get a copyright to the source code, and you get a copyright to the object code because it's a derivative work of the source code. And then one last thing I want to give background information about is this notion of a copyright license. A copyright license is basically a contract from the copyright owners with certain terms and conditions to let others use the work. So if you have a copyright license, you're giving a third party, a non-owner of the copyright, some right under this exclusive bundle to like either copy or modify or distribute the work under certain conditions. So when it comes to software, when we think of a software license, we usually think about proprietary software licenses. And these licenses are actually designed to kind of clamp down on access to source code. Usually you don't even get the source code, you get the object code, and they keep their source code or their secret sauce hidden. And you only get access to either the object code or some minified code. But these proprietary software licenses are designed to like clamp down on the use of their software and the ability to get at the source code. So a proprietary software license would like restrict republishing of the software, so you can't like distribute the software without the owner's permission, restrict any kind of modification of the software, maybe limit the number of installs or seats that can be used with the software. Sometimes they restrict like the certain type of commercial use for the software. So a proprietary software may say like, okay, you can use this software for your own personal use, but if you want to use this for a commercial purpose, then you have to pay us more money. And sometimes I think almost every proprietary license will limit the software owner's liability for damages. So for example, if their software causes your computer to like lose data, the license says that you agree not to hold them liable for any kind of damage caused by their software. So proprietary software, limits and restricts access to the source code and limits and restricts how end users use the software. And a lot of software developers thought that this type of system fails to strike the right balance between the rights of software owners and the rights of software users. Because software, unlike a lot of other creative works, is utilitarian in nature and it's not expressive. And so developers that keep their source code hidden get all the benefits of the exclusive control of their work, but society doesn't really receive all the knowledge that they can get in return. So like basically like what happened to this promoting the progress of science and useful arts? These open source advocates would say that these proprietary licenses society wasn't getting the benefit that they should under the framework of copyright law. So these rebels, like they basically like stood up on their workstations, they held up their cans of Jolt Cola and screamed revolution, and like good coders, they hack the copyright system by creating these open source licenses. And what these licenses do is basically require free usage of the software and allow end users to modify the software and publish the software. And the most important thing for them was that it required that the public have access to source code, especially modified source code. So if you make improvements to open source code, you have to give that improvement into the public if you're going to use our open source code. And there's literally hundreds of open source licenses out there, and they fall all over the map as far as what things they specify in their terms and conditions. But generally, people categorize open source licenses as protective on one end and permissive on another end. And permissive means like these licenses tend to give priority to freedom of usage of the code, whereas protective tend to prioritize access to source code. And I'm going to talk more about that in detail. So let's talk about protective or copyleft licenses. They're also known as strict licenses. And these licenses require a reciprocal licensing of modified source code. So the most popular one is the GPL license or general public license. This is in the case that I was talking about in the beginning, this is what Project Left was licensing their code under. And basically, this license allows anyone to use, publish, sell, modify GPL software as long as you abide by their terms under the GPL. And one of those terms is that whenever you release GPL software, modified or unmodified, you have to license that software under the GPL license. So it's kind of self-replicating. And you also, when you release GPL software, is you have to include that license text in the code. And the other really important thing is that when you release GPL software, then you have to publish the source code. And any modified software has to state that it's modified from the original. Now, releasing software under GPL has a specific meaning. Releasing means distributing the software outside your organization. So if you are exchanging code between employees of the same organization, that's not considered a release, and you can keep any GPL modified code proprietary. Basically, you don't have to publish the code as long as it stays within the organization. And even if you hire like a consultant to modify an internal copy of the code, that's not considered a release. So as long as you keep that code internal and you're not somehow like selling it or providing it to the outside, like what we basically think of as a release of code, then you don't have to publish the source code. So if you're hired as a consultant to modify GPL code for a company, you don't have to publish that source code under the terms of GPL. Another important term under the GPL is that you can include digital rights management in GPL code, but you can't sue someone from circumventing the DRM that you put in. So this falls under the freedom of usage of the code. So you can add DRM to GPL code, but you can't sue someone for hacking the code to get around the DRM. And last important thing about GPL code is that, or the license, is that it's compatible with trademarks. So you can have GPL code and it is open source, but you can have a trademark for that code and protect and sue people for trademark infringement. So for example, the Debian distribution, Debian and its logo are trademarked, and you can take Debian source code and release it, but you can't call that code your modified Debian code Debian anymore. You have to change how you market your code, and that's to protect the reputation of Debian and Debian's ecosystem. So there's no conflict there. Let me go to the next slide. So we talked about how releasing means that it has to go outside of your organization, but this creates a SaaS loophole. And basically, if you only need to open source code when it leaves your company, then you can keep GPL code proprietary if it's a network service. So a company like MongoDB, it doesn't make sense for them to open source their code under the GPL license, because someone could take MongoDB's code, and MongoDB, in case you don't know, that they're basically a network service for database. That's part of one of their services. So someone could modify MongoDB's source code, create a competing service, and never release their modified code. So these network protective open source licenses were created to get around that loophole. And basically they required that anytime you are using open source code over a computer network, you have to have this reciprocal license. So they made it it wasn't just a release of code, it was any code that's accessed over a computer network. These type of licenses corrected a lot of problems with that open source advocates perceived, but the problem was that some people thought these licenses went too far. So under open source, you had the freedom to run, to copy, distribute, to change and improve software, but it created a problem if you're trying to make open source libraries. If you wanted to make an open source library, people were reluctant to adopt those libraries into their proprietary code, because then that would require them to release their code, their source code, and no longer have it proprietary. So it created an opportunity for proprietary software libraries to become industry standards, and that wasn't the goal of the open source movement. They wanted the libraries, the industry standard libraries, to be open source. So to address that problem, there was a weakly protective license created. And these weakly protective licenses allow the coexistence of proprietary software with open source libraries. And the way that works is, if you have a software library under a weakly protective license, then any proprietary that just merely uses your library can remain proprietary. You don't have to open source it. But if your code is based on a library, then you have to, and so if it's modifying the library, then your code has to then be released under this weakly protective license. So there's this distinction between, is it using a library or is it based on a library? And it's sometimes difficult to define when a proprietary code is based on a library and when it just merely uses the library. So if code modifies an open source library, then it's basically based on the work, and it has to be open source. But if your code just dynamically links to a library, then it's considered it's just considered using the library, and your code can stay proprietary. Now, the problem comes in with statically linked libraries. They can fall under a based on definition, and they might have to be open source. So if you're creating software you may have to configure your code bundler like a Webpack to bundle the open source libraries separate from your proprietary code. But then again, some people say that it's not. And you know what? A lot of developers aren't interested in these little intricacies of based on and uses. They don't really care about like the strict doctrines of open source philosophy. They're just looking for people to get the maximum benefit from their software. So permissive licenses come to the rescue. And basically, permissive licenses say you can do whatever you want with our code. You can take our code, you can modify it, you can keep it for yourself, you can even sell it without contributing anything back. Maybe some of these licenses require you to do nothing more than to keep the original copyright notice in your code for the permissive license. So I don't think permissive licenses fully embrace the goals of the more protective licenses of having open source libraries or open source code available to everyone. They don't require developers to share improvements to the open source code. Developers can still release the improvements to these permissive licenses, this code under the permissive license, but they don't have any legal obligation to do so. But one of the benefits of permissive licenses is that they make open source code adoption much easier. There's typically no conflict between a protective license and proprietary licenses with permissive licenses. So you can have a proprietary code that brings in permissive licenses and still keep your code proprietary. So permissive license software is more likely to be commercially sponsored. And in fact, like a lot of commercial developers of software have caught on to this and are sponsoring open source licenses under open source projects under permissive license because they're creating goodwill by helping produce code for the common good while still retaining the ability to use the resulting code from these projects in their proprietary products. So I just want to talk about some other important terms and conditions with open source licenses that kind of apply to permissive licenses, to restrictive licenses, and everything in between. They just kind of appear in a lot of these licenses. So many open source licenses disclaim any kind of warranty or liability for damages or software support, and that's just a good idea. You don't want to be sued for any damages caused by your open source project. Some licenses require any contributor-owned patents that would be infringed by the software to be licensed to the users of the software. So if you're contributing to an open source project and you have some patents that read on the software that's being contributed to, then they require you to license that patent to the community that's using the software. And some of them have this patent retaliation clause that if you institute some kind of patent litigation against anyone using the software, then the open source license will be revoked for you. Some software licenses require that you credit the original author, and some licenses prohibit using the original author's name to endorse or promote your modified code. So now that we kind of have this landscape, we can be more we can kind of give more definition to all these different types of licenses. So On the right side of the spectrum, we have the permissive licenses, these MIT licenses, BSD, Apache. And before I go into that, I should just say, like, across the board, a lot of licenses require some kind of attribution and license notice that you add that into your code. But on the right side, we have permissive licenses, and they take the hands-off approach. They say you could do whatever you want to the code, to our code. You can keep code that you're developing with our code proprietary. You don't have to disclose the source code. There's no reciprocal license required. On the left side, you have the protective licenses, and those require reciprocal licensing for modifications. If you modify source code under the protective license, then your modification also has to be released under a protective license, and you have to make that source code available to users. And then you have in the middle the weakly protective licenses, and those exempt proprietary code that merely uses open source libraries. And on the very left, you have strongly protective licenses, and these are the licenses that close the SAS loophole and require open source code that's used over a computer network to be made available under a reciprocal license. So this is just a small segment of all the open source licenses that are available, but these are the most popular types of open source licenses around. And there's no really correct open source license to use. Different licenses reflect different philosophies about the public's right to access the code, different views about the developer's ability to keep their code proprietary, and different goals about code adoption. Like an MIT licensed software will probably be adopted more readily than a GPL licensed code, because there's less restriction on what you need to do. But the really important point is that open source licenses are very important, because the default rule is that you have no right to modify or copy software without the copyright owner's permission. So if let's say you found some software on GitHub and it didn't specify any license, then you run the risk of getting sued for copyright infringement by that repository's owner, because it doesn't say whether you have what the permissions are. You're just kind of like left wondering, am I ever going to get sued for copyright infringement? So software without any license is by default closed source software. And here's the top open source licenses as of 2019. And the first three most popular licenses are the permissive licenses. They account for over half of the open source licenses that are being used. And it wasn't always the case. It used to be that the restrictive licenses were by far the most popular licenses. And I kind of attribute the growth of permissive licenses to this trend of software companies embracing the open source model of code development, where they get the benefit of goodwill in the software community, plus the ability to use the software in their proprietary products. So one more topic that I really want to discuss is license compatibility. Open source license compatibility is a big issue. And what this graph is showing is when you have an open source license, sometimes it can't coexist with another open source license. In this graph, an open source license that was at the tail end of an arrow can be incorporated into source code of a different open source license, as long as there's a path to it. So let me give you an example. This is a lot harder to describe than it is in real life. So Apache 2.0, any software under Apache 2.0 license can be combined with code under a GPL v3 license, because there is a path of arrows leading from Apache 2.0 to GPL v3. But you can't combine Apache 2.0 software, licensed software, with GPL v2 code, because there's no path through the arrows to GPL v2 from Apache 2.0, and you can't go against the arrow. You can only go in the direction of the arrow when you're looking to combine code under different licenses. So you can't go from a strongly protective license. You can't relicense code to a permissive license. You can only move in one direction. And so if you wanted to maintain your project's license, here's some general principles. First, unless you have permission to use proprietary software, written permission, then don't include any proprietary software in your projects. In your project, you would be violating that proprietary software license. So if you have a proprietary project, you don't want to include other projects' proprietary software, and you don't want to include any protective licensed code in your project, because that would require you to release your project under the protective license. But in general, you can include permissive licensed code into your proprietary project. Now, if you have a project under a protective license, then you still can't put in somebody's proprietary code into your project, but you can include both, in general, permissive licensed code and protective licensed code into your protective project. And finally, if you have a permissive project licensed code, then basically the only type of code that you can include in there is other code under a permissive licensed software. You can't include protective code, because that would require you to include that protective license in your project. So basically, code under a permissive license is like the universal donor of the software world. So this brings me back to the cease and desist letter. So remember, we have a project left that's under the GPL protective open source license, and that requires any modified project left code to be licensed under the GPL. And then we have project right that is licensed under MIT, which is a permissive license that you can keep the code from project right proprietary. You don't have to open source the code. So basically, project left was accusing project right of relicensing its GPL code as MIT licensed code. So someone could essentially take project left's code, modify it, and keep it proprietary if they get it from project right. So I looked into the different code bases, and basically there were three reasons why code in project right was similar to project left. So the first reason was that some files in both projects contain source code from a third-party library that both projects used, and that was okay. The second reason why there were similarities in code was that some files had a common contributor to both projects, and that contributor licensed the same code to both projects, and that was also fine. And the third reason, which was actually the most satisfying reason to point out, was that there were some code files in Project Left's repository that were copied from Project Right's repository. And we found this out by looking at the copyright notice dates. And we saw that they had actually taken code from Project Left had taken code from Project Right. So we sent them a response to the cease and desist letter, pointing out why these project files had similarities in code, and reminding them that Project Left had an obligation to include Project Right's attribution, because they had an MIT license that required you to give credit to the authors, that required them to give attribution to Project Right. So we sent them the letter, and we never heard anything else from Project Left, which for lawyers, that's a success. And that's pretty much the end of my talk. I have here my information in case anybody wants to contact me. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I am happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, if you have any questions, put them in chat. In the meantime, I've got a couple. Recently, I saw some news articles about some projects moving from one license to another, and there was like an uproar about that. So what happens if you do want to, if your project wants to move from one to another? Is that permissible? Do you have to like say everything from this point previous was under this previous license, but everything from this point forward is under a new license? How does that work?
Yeah, so people that rely on your previous license still have a right to use your code under the old license, and then going forward, modifications would be licensed under the new license. But there's a big problem. If you have a lot of contributors to your code, then you need to get the contributors on board to change the license. And there's a lot of like there's a split in the legal world on whether, as a project maintainer, you have the right to unilaterally change everybody's code to the new license, or whether you need to get everybody's permission. And just under a software governance consideration, it's even if you could do it as a maintainer unilaterally, you probably want to get all the contributors on board so that they don't just leave your project and go start a new one. But that's a very good question.
So if you do have contributors and you change the license, well, you did say that all the previous code would be in the earlier license, so their code would still be under the previous license, and they don't necessarily have to contribute any more code to your project once it changed licenses.
Right. But if you're taking all that code and then saying like, okay, now this code is under a new license, like, do you have to get the contributor of that source file to agree to that? And there's a split in legal opinions. It's never been litigated, but I tend to think that you do, and I tend to think that like just under good politics that you want the contributor to do that.
Seems like ethically it's the good thing to do. Whether it's legally responsible or not, it seems like it's the good thing to do. I also have another question. So you mentioned the GPL license allows DRM, but it also allows DRM circumvention. So why would you even add DRM to a GPL licensed source code in the first place?
It's in the license. So I wanted to make sure that information was in there. I guess, if you have some kind of code that, uses password protection, then you may need that in there. But, it does let people, try to reverse engineer that password protection or something.
Okay. And then also, I know that there's Creative Commons is a term that's out there that tends to, I see it a lot with like images and things like graphics. Does that apply to source code at all? Since you mentioned source code could be considered a creative pursuit.
Yeah, it's generally used for like more artistic works that you think of. I have never seen it used on source code, but it's it's very similar, where,
Yeah.
where you have to give attribution, and it's a lot less detailed than these open source licenses generally, but it's also, I guess you could say, it's very similar to the permissive licenses, where like in MIT is, if you read it, it's maybe 3 or 4 lines, and so it's similar that way, just very 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 loose, and it doesn't have to be that rigorous.
Yeah. Okay. And then if you did want to license your project under a specific license, what's the process of doing that? Do you just say my project is MIT and then that's it? Or how does that work in a legal sense?
That's
What are
pretty
the
much
necessary
it.
steps?
So copyright is automatic. And so if you wanted to license your code under one of these open source licenses, MIT, for example, then you would just include that MIT license in your source code. I think GitHub makes this very easy by letting you just click what it is, and you have a license file. But basically, you're just giving notice to people that this is the license that I have, and if you want to use my code, these are my terms and conditions. And you may want to include that on a web page or some other. If you're only releasing the object code, then you may want to also include that in the object code somewhere.
Okay. And then you may not know this, but I think I saw recently, not recently, but at some point, like almost like a wizard, where you're like answer some questions about how you would like for your code to be protected or be permissive. Do you know of any resources like that where you could go through and say, I want these things, these protections. I want to make sure that this part's free and completely permissive. So it leads you to a specific license. Because you mentioned there's tons of licenses.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
So I don't know, but I think that's a brilliant tool to have. Just so you want to line what your values are with the license that you want to give. A lot of people just I'll just release it under MIT, but they don't realize that, okay, like I put a lot of effort into my code, and for people to benefit from that, I feel like I want others to share in that code. Mm-hmm. So unless you know that, you really just kind of like blindly click a license, which is not that great.
Yeah. Let's say you did blindly click a license. Could that get you in trouble at all?
No, I don't think it can get you in trouble. It's just
okay.
It just may not align with your values are.
Sure. So you're not like, I guess if you included other people's code and then blindly clicked a license, that might get you in trouble. Like your example of the lawsuit you were.
Yeah. When you right. I guess we're talking about your own, your own code. But if you start using other people's code, then yes, you have to make sure that you're abiding by the terms of the license. And so, if you are creating some MIT code, and then you start using a GPL code in your code base, like say your dependencies have GPL code, then that could get you in trouble, and it could get the person that is using your code in trouble.
So you kind of, obviously this is full stack, and so we talk a lot about web development. And you mentioned a little bit about like your web pack or your package that you're providing your visitors to your website. How important is it for people out there to really go through the packages they're using and find out which licenses all those packages are using? Because some packages include other packages, which include other packages, right. And it's like dependency hell. So how stringent do you have to be on going through and making sure that all those licenses add up and you're doing the right thing?
So you're talking to a lawyer who is going to tell you, oh, it's very important,
right?
Because if you're a big corporation, you have deep pockets, and you might get sued for violating, an open source license. In reality, if it's a small project, it's not that big of a deal. But for big companies, there's a whole industry out there that audit their code base, and make sure that all the dependencies and subdependencies all conform to a license. And you can, they get paid a lot of money to audit the code and make sure that it conforms to the licenses. And there's a lot of companies that have just a blanket rule, no open source code, because they don't even want to deal with that headache.
Yeah. That's interesting. I know that a lot of people just like don't even think about it. There's like, this package looks good and this one does what I want. I'll grab this one, and it's like, smorgasbord, take what you want. But the reality is, if you get big enough, then and you're still using those packages and you don't know what's in them, then I guess you become a potential target at least. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that's really cool. I have put a link in the YouTube chat for to join our Slack community. So if you have any other questions, we're going to talk about this after. Make sure to you can either email or talk to Ido here. Let me put your info back up there on Twitter, or on email or his website, or you can hop in our Slack and we can direct you there, or hopefully answer any questions you might have if we can answer them. And with that, I think we'll kind of wrap it up. Ido, do you have anything last pieces of wisdom to provide us?
I just want to thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And, this is great that you're putting this on. Thank you very much.
Cool. I appreciate that. Yeah. I was telling Ido before we started, my dad's a lawyer, and I'm a music business major in Nashville. And one of my favorite classes was copyright law. I loved learning about, how to copyright songs and all that kind of stuff. And actually I wanted to own my own music production company that would basically copyright songs. So I'm a tech nerd, obviously, but I kind of nerd out on this stuff too. It's probably in my blood since my dad is in this. But anyway, thank you so much, Ido. And thank you all for watching. Again, we are a community. So if you have anything that you need from us, please let me know. Again, that's in the Slack community. Join that on the link, or put any comments in the YouTube video afterwards. I'll check those occasionally as well. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Bye.